Well, hello. So, on this channel, we used to do some things like responding to some of Steven Crowder's uploads in the Change My Mind segment, and we did a handful of those in the past. But I finally got around to watching his upload, Thanksgiving Isn't Racist, Change My Mind. I had been meaning to watch it as soon as it came out, because we followed the series, and like I said, we made a few responses on this channel. But I gotta tell you, I made it about 10 minutes into it, and then I turned it off, and I was like, what am I even doing watching this one? Because it's such an obvious statement. Of course, Thanksgiving isn't racist. And eventually, after a little while, I decided to pick up again, just at least see what they had to say. Maybe they would have some interesting discussions in this one. But I think it's a very peculiar topic, and I've noticed this in most of Steven Crowder's uploads. Like when he's talking about something like, say, for example, hate speech isn't real. He's not actually saying that hate speech isn't real or that it doesn't exist. What he's really saying is that there are no laws in America that are preventing people from using certain types of speech and language that are not related to calls of action. So he gets a little bit bizarre and confusing with his titles, which is done on purpose, and it's also done for the clickbait factor. And a lot of people, and there were not that many people that he did show in this debate. I wish he could have shown some different, we had like 10, 12, 15 different perspectives and just little smaller segments or something like that. Or maybe you just put out a part two or something, because a lot of the people were just saying, yeah, okay, Thanksgiving isn't racist. Very clearly, Thanksgiving is not a racist holiday. It is about giving thanks. Like, what are you thankful for? Any person of any race and any background can be thankful for things. Well, but in this one, they really got into the concept of race and, like, what is racism? I think a lot of people in our current contemporary day and age describe racism as prejudice plus power. Because have you ever noticed that, for example, people are saying like that, I can't be racist against you because you're a white male. I'm a white male, so I hear that stuff from time to time, and I don't really hear it too much said to my face. I hear it in the media, especially when you're watching garbage on YouTube and people make comments like that, like maybe some of the things where people go into the protests and then they start interviewing people in the crowds. They say things like that. I can't be racist against you because you're a white male. So, but how on earth could they say something like that? Because they believe that racism is prejudice plus power. And in many of these things, what we try to do is that we try to actually just play the opposition to somebody like Steven Crowder. But I actually think it's very good that he just kind of put up the definitions on the screen. This is what racism is. This is what prejudice is. We pulled this out of the dictionary. And one person in there, I forget her name or something. It was something like Safa, that I think the person he mentioned who celebrates Ramadan and such, he interviewed her, and she simply said that racism has to be institutional. No, it doesn't. That's a ridiculous thing to say. Now, to give a little bit of pushback towards Steven Crowder, I believe that he was giving too much credit to the colonizers and the settlers and the Europeans and who colonized America. The fact of the matter is, first and foremost, history happened the way it did, and nobody is responsible for the crimes of their ancestors 300 years ago. Some British guy was getting on my case once about the American Revolution a couple years ago, and I'm like, dude, you're still mad about that? Let it go. Plus, I had nothing to do with that or something. 1776 and all that, like, give me a break. But it's just, you really have to recognize that I believe he's giving them a little bit too much credit. And the first thing that we have to say about that is, two wrongs do not make a right. Just because there were atrocities committed by the Native Americans, that does not excuse any sort of atrocity that was created by the colonizers and the settlers. And in all reality, I think the point that a lot of the people he was debating were trying to convey to him is something that we're only sort of looking through history through one particular lens. And Steven's trying to, of course, provide an alternative, but then they're sort of saying that same thing to him. You're still only looking at things through one particular lens. For example, he says they purchased the island of Manhattan for a shipload of various items, right? And then the Native Americans asked for it back, and then they said, like, hey, no, this is just the concept of leasing. He said that they did not understand the concept of private property rights. Well, that's just looking at it through one angle. You could just very, very easily say that the colonizers and the settlers did not understand the concept of leasing and temporary property rights, and just that well, yeah, this is our tradition. When we accept a ship full of beaver pelts or whatever the hell it was, then that means you only get it for a certain extended period of time, and then this has a very finite limit. Once again, it's like he's only using the European model. There have been a lot of conversations about this recently. Like, even Milo Yiannopoulos once said that people aren't white supremacists. Most people are just Western supremacists. And I think, though, that it is going to be completely inappropriate to say things that, like, the Native Americans were more problematic prior to the European colonizers. And I know problematic wasn't the word that Stephen described, but he was saying that they were a lesser civilization. And he's being nasty to prove a point, and just being nasty to kind of get people to start talking about him, which that's one thing Steven Crowder is very good at. But to be honest, if you're going to look at it that way, did he examine all Native American tribes? He talks about the Wampanoag and the Pequots and various other ones, but the Iroquois as well. But does he examine every single Native American tribe? I mean, you would have to go through every single one before you would say that, oh, all Native Americans were inferior to the European colonizers. They were inferior to the settlers. You would, and I'm not even joking, because you might look at one tribe and look at the way that they conducted their society, and then you would be like, oh wow, this is actually so much better. You would only need one to disprove that example. And I know some people would just be like, well, that's just the exception that proves the rule. No, it's the absolute opposite. It's like, it's the one that would actually show that it would be some sort of way to conduct a society that could be better off. And in all reality, I do kind of think that Steven Crowder did bring up some good points about how we really sort of have this type of romanticization about Native American traditions, such as that they're just in love with the earth and that they're just in love with unity in the cosmos and it's all harmonious. But yes, there were lots of atrocities that were committed. And we do see that there's a certain kind of anti-white person presence in that. Like, for example, I mean, if you look at the villains in some film like Dances with Wolves, I just watched that on the YouTube Free Movies channel. It kept recommending it. I finally saw Dances with Wolves. Supposedly, the extended version of Dances with Wolves is just short of 4 hours. I saw a 3-hour version. The white soldiers are the enemy in that one, and the Native Americans are the heroes, as well as, two white people that learn to live with the Native Americans. But the thing is about it is, I do have to insist, it is inappropriate to say that Native American traditions are inferior to that of the colonizers without listing every single one, and because you would only need one to sort of find a superior point right there. Another thing that was discussed in this was the concept of how the Native Americans were given reservation land, and this is something else that the settlers did not have to do. They could have just killed them all. Well, that is still something that is bad. We have things like the Trail of Tears, and we have lots of abuses that were committed against the Native Americans in the process of putting them onto reservations. And for a nation that talks greatly about private property rights, it was something that was done through force. But it's like, two wrongs do not make a right, just because the Native Americans also committed atrocities. And there were even some other things that he didn't talk about. The Quebecois French actually used to hire Native Americans to go attack the settlers of British descent here in America, and they would capture people, and then they would use the people as slaves. The Quebecois would, in short, be enslaving other white people. And I was talking to somebody about that who wrote a book on the subject a couple years ago, and but the Native Americans were kind of like the middle people. They were like almost slave catchers for the Quebecois French, and it's like there were lots of atrocities. But the thing is, everybody creates atrocities. Everybody creates everybody has imperfections in their history. And who is to say that these types of abuses did not happen in Europe? And one of the things that we really need to talk about is the concept of how civilization functions. Because a point that was brought up by Steven Crowder was that the Native Americans were here for thousands of years, here in the Americas, North and South America, but they were not developing the land. They didn't really develop sophisticated travel methods and sophisticated civilizations and cities. He just says that they were not sophisticated, that they were a lesser form of civilization, and that they were just not as advanced. One of the things that happens is that when you have very wide open territory in a moderate and temperate climate, you have expansion. You have like people that resort more toward traveling, nomading, and just moving around. There's a lot more migration and movement. You see this very clearly in Africa with the Bantu migrations that lasted about 3,000, 3,500 years. People are moving to various places. This is something that I've really noticed about humanity, and I haven't heard it from too many people, but it is that human beings will expand outward until every possible place of habitable land, and even going into space. That's why space is called the final frontier. Because people will live right up against the ice sheets. They will go down the Andes Mountains all the way to the Tierra del Fuego and Puerto Williams and Puerto Toro in Chile, our most southern cities in the world. They go as far off as they can. But the thing is, when you're going off in Europe, you're going to hit the ocean much more quickly, and they don't have these enormously vast spaces of land that we have in North America, the United States and Canada and all that, as well as, of course, many places in South America too. And Mexico, of course, also has lots of open, vast land in somewhat of a mild climate in various parts of the city. Some parts of Mexico are very harsh. So that's one of the reasons for that, and that is not really to say that anything is more advanced or less advanced. Having indoor plumbing has nothing to do with advancement in civilization. It's more about you have to look at everything in its entirety, such as literature, theology, mysticism, rituals and traditions, and you can find disgusting rituals perhaps in every culture of the world. You can find lots of abuses and atrocities that happened in Europe. And Steven Crowder brings up the example that, 50% of the Native Americans were wiped out by the colonizers and the settlers. Well, how many of the settlers and the colonizers were wiped out by the Native Americans? He says 30%. Well, that sounds like an enormous difference, 30% versus 50%, and I'm really surprised that other people didn't call him out on that and just be like, well, that's a much smaller percentage. The whole point is, though, you have to sort of recognize the value of humanity from everyone, no matter if they're Native American, if they are of European descent. It's about acknowledging everybody's humanity, and Steven Crowder is not a racist. I will say that very clearly. Steven Crowder is not a racist, but what he likes to do is he likes to get nasty about a lot of subjects, such as race would be one of them, or even women's issues, like when he says there is no rape culture is a myth. He's not really being a misogynist. What he's saying is just something nasty about women, so people will listen to him online. He'll get more clicks, and they can hear somewhat of a heated discussion. There was one woman in the video, I forget her name, she had blonde hair and she was wearing glasses. She was somewhat articulate, but some of the things that she had been talking about with Crowder were very simple, in the sense that she's saying, okay, you've clearly read up on a lot of this stuff just prior to filming this, whereas a lot of other people probably have not read those same things, and a lot of things are excluded from our educational system, and then you're just trying to call people out on some factoids that they probably weren't exposed to. It's not necessarily significant of any conclusion or any sort of argumentative fact in itself. It's just that you just pulled some things out of, like a history book that you had your team go through just prior to filming the episode. And in short, he's trying to say a lot of the things he's saying are just like, okay, yeah, you know something we don't know. That's delightful, but that doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. And I would say, though, if we actually do have a heart of the issue, and this is kind of deviating from Steven Crowder's thing, I would say that a point that Steven talked about, it's not deviating from him at all, actually, because this upload's all about Steven Crowder and Thanksgiving isn't racist. Changed my mind. There was a thing in there when they're talking about how does our educational system present the concept of the European settlers that came to the Americas versus the Native Americans who lived there. And what I would say about that is that we really have this impression that the Europeans came there and that they were just, they didn't value the concept of the Native American humanity. That is the thing that I believe is taught in our history classes, and I didn't hear it exactly expressed like that in the debates that Steven had in his video. When I believe that they show that, okay, they came here and it was like the Native Americans were given smallpox and that Native Americans didn't know how to domesticate horses, but all of those things, they really show that the colonizers were not valuing the humanity of the Native Americans. And what a lot of people are now talking about is, why are we only talking about the European colonizers? If you want to be like, well, that's our history, no, it isn't. that's like something that is quite different. And then you're even going to get people saying that, well, maybe we can bring up Columbus, but we can't talk about anything like the Nordic people that settled in Newfoundland in the, what was it, 1100s or the 1000 year. It was just in the early part of the new millennium. We still have the Viking settlements in Newfoundland that we can still see to this day. We have archaeological remains of that stuff. I think it would have been such a better discussion if you had been talking about how Columbus Day isn't racist. Changed my mind, because then you could just be like, well, they're just trying to force the Judeo-Christian upon America, even though that's not really the correct model of history at all. Many people came prior to Columbus to the United States of America, as we mentioned. Was it Leif Erikson? Was that the guy that was leading those expeditions? Not to mention the Native Americans themselves. I mean, there were 3 major waves of migration across the Bering Strait, and the people who are the Alaskan natives today are the descendants of the 3rd migration, and of course the people who are farther south are the descendants of the 1st and the 2nd migration. There are 3 major waves of that phase, and that happened, I think we're going through at least 20,000 BCE, but once again, when you have that a very expansive, wide open land, and mostly a moderate temperate climate like all of the United States of America, like the bulk of the Midwest and the South, the Southwest, and like you have lots of wide open spaces where people can expand across, you're not going to have the same types of civilization that you had in Europe. Whereas, like once, as I said, you hit the ocean very quickly. Not to mention, Europe has a few different things, because we had the Mesopotamian civilization, right? Remember 4 major river valley civilizations: the Nile, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus, and the Huanghe, otherwise known as the Yellow River Valley, and that is in China, the only one that survived. But supposedly, Mesopotamia poured over into Greece. There was a massive wave of migration the Mesopotamian civilization of the Tigris-Euphrates moved toward Greece, and then that's why that civilization was able to build up, while many other people throughout the world, say in Africa, were migrating around, and as well as in the Americas. But that, of course, happened much later than Africa, because, as they like to say, civilization began in Africa, life began in Africa, and I do mean that. We do have new archaeological finds that may be tens of thousands of years older than what we thought they were, and it really shows that there could be civilization in Africa. It's just the remains didn't survive that long. But definitely humanity began there. But you have to look at the entirety of things. It's not only about indoor plumbing, which he made it seem, and it's not only about having more advancements in like the domestication of horses and such. It's also about what were they able to create? What type of artwork did they have? What were the philosophies on life? What were the principles of morality? How did they view the cosmos? You notice this all over across the world. No matter what sort of tribe or civilization, they have cosmology. They have a view on how the universe is, how it came to be, and many people tie it into theological aspects. What were the values of that civilization, and what were the reasons and motivations for them to create things? Maybe if you were to find some things like, if you were to find certain barbaric sects that might have just been like, we don't care, we just destroy because we can, that would be a bad thing. But the problem is, though, that's not the majority of Native American history and civilization, and I don't pretend to be an expert on that, but from the limited exposure, you really see that there is another side of the situation that Steven Crowder really neglected. And to say that Native American culture is inferior to European culture is purely incorrect. To say that these two are different, yes. Think about all the atrocities that happened in Europe. If you're going to look at all the wars, if you're going to be looking at all of the people that were look at, the Visigoths and the problems of the Carolinian lands prior to Charlemagne and such. All sorts of things are just in enormous amounts of conflict. And not to mention, if you're going to look at what about the Dark Ages or something? The Dark Ages was primarily confined to Europe. The Dark Ages was not worldwide. You had things like the Islamic civilizations were in their golden age during the Dark Ages, not to mention the Chinese and the rise of Chinese spirituality. China also received a very large advancement in terms of philosophy and culture during the so-called quote-unquote Dark Ages. Those things are mostly reserved to Europe, and they aren't even that dark to begin. We used to call them the dim ages because they were not dark, they were dim, and I would have to completely agree with that assessment. I think a lot of people are just being very critical of that time period because they're trying to put down something that is once again contrary to this type of Western civilization tradition that we try to overly glorify. But in reality, you're going to find that there are definitely people that are more advanced. There are definitely methods of living that are more advanced. But it's not so much about the creations as it is about those who, about how they treat the people and how they value humanity. And while there were atrocities committed by the Native Americans toward many different people, I do not deny that, you would have to go through every single tribe and just be like, nope, these people are inhumane, these people are inhumane, these people are inhumane. And if you don't do that, then you're just going to be like, you won't know. You will never get a definitive answer. And, that could be something we could explore in a future upload, where we could be like, where really are the boundaries? How really inhumane were these tribes? Or is Steven Crowder completely correct? And if he is correct, I will gladly admit it, because one of the things we have to do is we have to be on the side of the truth. And even sometimes the truth does have bitter pills for us to swallow. So the thing is, though, I would really just like to say that the point of why people would be opposed to something like what Steven Crowder was talking about in his upload is they're just like, in our present day and age, we just need to recognize that all human beings have value, no matter what race or ethnicity they're from, and we can find the valuable parts of history, and it's not just because some people have differences in their past. We need to focus on the things that bring us together, and that is the unity of humanity, and finding the goodness in other people's traditions, and learning from the bad parts of history, so that we do not repeat these same mistakes in the future, and so we do not view somebody as an enemy. Division is not really how a civilization is founded. A civilization is founded by people coming together to work for constructive efforts. It was not founded by warfare. It was founded by trade. Have you heard this before? It's like the trade hypothesis versus the warfare hypothesis. The archaeologists are actually saying now, such as, when people come together, it's for a constructive purpose. It's for the interactions of people in a positive and constructive way, not in defensive, out of fear, or out of trying to destroy something, but rather to come together and actually share a message of goodness with the world. Trade, cooperation, working together, togetherness, unity, all of that. Those are good things, and that's what propels a civilization forward. That's why so many people talk about infrastructure. In Congress, infrastructure is the most bipartisan thing you can imagine, because it's all about bridges and tunnels and building roads to do what? To unite people together. And it is through this message of unity that was greatly lacking from Steven Crowder's upload. That is just, we have to recognize that putting people on reservations is bad. Did the people on reservations do bad things? Did they do bad things? Yes, of course they did. But two wrongs don't make a right. Both sides did bad things, and from that point onward, we need to learn from those mistakes so we can overcome them, and that humanity can feel more unified. Well, that's all for me now. I would love for you guys to weigh in. Please leave a comment below. Like this upload if you liked it, or if you don't like it, please like it anyway. I just want to share just some positivity and optimism and optimismity. Some silly words to end a silly upload. Excuse me for rambling too much, but until next time.